Orla was paid to be invisible. For years, she carried the trays and swept the ash and slipped out before anyone learned her name. Because in the house of Severin Cade, a servant who got noticed was a servant who vanished. She was good at it. Then, on the last cold night before the family crowned its king, she made one mistake. She fell asleep in a bed no living soul was allowed to touch. She was certain it would cost her life. Instead, when the sun rose, every hardened man in that house sank to his knees, and the king knelt lowest of all. Orla Sorrel owned 3 things worth naming: a coat that had stopped being warm 2 winters ago, a pair of shoes she had re-soled herself with glue and patience, and a small carved sparrow, no bigger than a thumbnail, worn smooth at the wings from a lifetime of being touched. The sparrow had belonged to her mother, or so the woman who raised her had always said, though that woman was gone now too, and there was no one left to ask what any of it had meant. Orla wore it on a cord beneath her collar, where no one could see it, because things that were seen in her life had a way of being taken. She had learned not to be seen. It was the only skill that had ever paid her rent, and she paid rent in 3 places at once: cleaning offices before dawn, and kitchens after dark, and anything in between that would have her. For years the agency had sent her to the Cade estate whenever the family had something to host, and the family hosted often. Funerals that were really warnings, dinners that were really trials, long nights where men in fine suits laughed too loudly, and someone always left through a side door and did not come back. Orla carried the trays. She swept the ash. She kept her eyes on the carpet and her name off every tongue, and in 3 years not one person who mattered had ever looked at her twice. That was how a person survived a house where being remembered was a kind of sentence. This time was different, and everyone knew it. This time the whole estate was scrubbed and lit and trembling, because in 3 days the family would hold the confirmation, the old rite that would name Severin Cade the true and permanent head of the house. For 20 years he had ruled as something less than that, a steward keeping a chair that was not his by blood, and in 3 days the council would make that chair his forever. The staff whispered about it in the pantry with the doors shut. They lit candles they would not explain. And they spoke the master's name, the way people speak the name of a storm they can already hear coming but cannot yet see, and not all of them wanted the confirmation at all. Orla had heard 2 of the oldest servants arguing in the larder that evening, quick and low, one of them saying it was wrong, that a thing had never been finished, that you did not bury a house's blood only because it had become easier to. The other had hissed at her to hush before someone heard. Then they had both seen Orla standing in the doorway with her tray, and had gone silent as stone. Orla had never met him. She hoped to keep it that way. She worked that first night until her hands shook and the clocks had long crawled past midnight, and when the last glass was dried and the last spoon counted, an old woman named Ilona found her swaying on her feet by the scullery door. Ilona ran the house, and had run it, people said, since before Severin was a boy. She had a face like a folded letter and eyes that missed nothing, and for reasons Orla could not explain, the old woman had been gentle with her from the very first night. "Go and sleep, child," Ilona told her. "The far end of the east gallery, the last of the servants' rooms. It is quiet there, and no one will trouble you before dawn." Orla took a candle, because the house cut its lights at night to spare what the family did not care to spend, and she climbed the narrow servants' stair and walked the long east gallery counting doors, too tired to think straight. But the gallery had been put under dust sheets for the confirmation. The furniture shrouded and shifted out of its usual places, and in the dark one door looked much like another. She lost her count somewhere past a covered mirror. She found a door that gave easily under her hand when so many others had been locked, and behind it lay a room warmer than any she had ever stood in, with a low fire someone had banked in the grate, and a bed as wide as a small boat, made up in linen so fine it caught the candlelight like moving water. She should have known. Some buried part of her did know, but she had been cold for so long. And the fire was real, and the bed was right there, and she told herself she would rest only a moment and be gone again before the house stirred. She pressed the sparrow to her throat out of old habit. She lay down on top of the covers in her uniform, meaning not to sleep at all. She was asleep before the candle guttered out. She did not know that the door which had opened for her opened for no one. She did not know the room had been sealed for 20 years, kept exactly as a dead man had left it, dusted but never entered, waiting. She did not know that in this house there was one law, older than Severin Cade, older than the council, older than fear itself, that the founder's bed would stay empty until his blood came home to it. And she did not know who had left the green door unlocked, or why. Orla woke because the light was wrong. For one slow, unguarded breath she did not move. The ceiling above her was painted, a pale field of clouds gone gray with age, and the warmth wrapped around her was so complete, so unfamiliar, that her body refused to believe in it and simply lay still inside it. She could not remember the last time she had been warm in her sleep. She could not remember the last time she had slept at all, without one ear kept open for a landlord, a shift bell, a hand testing a door. For that single breath she was nobody and nowhere, and perfectly safe, and it was the kindest thing that had happened to her in longer than she could count. Then she remembered where she was, and the warmth turned to ice in her blood. She sat up too fast. The room resolved around her in the thin gray morning, and it was worse than she had feared. This was no servant's room. The walls were hung with dark old paintings, in frames gone dull with tarnish. A tall clock stood stopped in the corner, its hands frozen at some hour no one had troubled to wind past. Everything here held the stillness of a place people entered only to remember someone. And on the table beside the bed sat a pair of a man's reading glasses and a cup furred gray with years of dust, resting exactly where a dead hand had set them down. She had slept in a tomb. She had slept in the bed of the dead. Orla had spent her whole life learning the precise shape of her own smallness. She had learned it from the woman who raised her, who had loved her in a hard and frightened way, and who had told her over and over that a girl with no name and no people survived only by taking up as little room in the world as she could. Do not be seen. Do not be wanted. Do not be owed anything, because the day you are owed is the day someone comes to collect. Orla had folded herself down so small, for so long, that she had forgotten she had ever been any other size. Being small had kept her breathing. Being small had also meant that no one in all her years had ever once looked at her and seen a person worth the trouble of keeping. And now she had laid her whole unwashed, unwanted self in the one place in this dangerous house that so plainly belonged to someone who had mattered more than she ever would. Her hand went to the sparrow at her throat. It was still there. She held it the way she always did when she was frightened, and she made herself think, if she was found here she would not simply be dismissed. She understood the house well enough to know that much. In a place like this, a trespass was not a mistake to be forgiven, but a message to be answered, and the answer was always the same, and it was always final. She had to be gone. She had to strip the bed of every sign of herself and slip back into the walls where she belonged, and pray the old woman had counted wrong, that no one knew, that the green door had opened for her in the dark and closed again, with no one the wiser. She swung her legs off the bed. Her shoes sat on the floor where she had stepped out of them, without remembering. She reached for them. That was when she heard the footsteps. Not one set, many. The soft, deliberate tread of people moving together through the gallery beyond the door, and beneath it a sound she could not place at first. A low murmur that rose and fell and did not sound like anger, and did not sound like a search. It sounded almost like prayer. It came closer. It stopped outside the door. For one wild instant, she let herself hope it would drift past, that whoever they were had business with some other room, some other ghost. The sound did not drift past. Orla froze with one shoe still in her hand. her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. There was nowhere to go. The window was 3 floors above the stones. The only door was the one the sound now stood behind. She thought of the garden, the staff never spoke of directly, the one where the ground was always freshly turned in one place or another, and she understood with a strange and terrible calm that she was about to see it up close. The handle turned, the door swung open, and an old woman stood framed in it, and it was Ilona, and Orla opened her mouth to beg, to explain, to swear it had been an accident, to offer up her small life in the smallest possible words. But Ilona was not looking at her the way a person looks at a thief in a forbidden room. The old woman had gone absolutely white, one weathered hand pressed flat against her own mouth, and her eyes were not on Orla's face at all. They were fixed, wide and wet and impossible to read, upon the small carved sparrow resting in the hollow of Orla's throat. And then, without a single word, the old woman, who had run the house of Severin Cade for longer than Orla had been alive, lowered herself down onto the cold floor and knelt. For a long moment Orla did not understand what she was seeing. The old woman was on her knees on the cold boards, her head bowed low, her lips moving around words too quiet to catch. It made no sense. People did not kneel to Orla. People stepped past Orla, around Orla, over Orla, the way a person steps over a crack in a pavement without ever once looking down. She had built her whole life on that fact. And now the woman who ran the most dangerous house in the city was folded on the floor in front of her, as though Orla were something holy. "Please," Orla whispered, "please get up. I am sorry. I got the door wrong. I will go. I swear I will go. Only please, do not." Ilona lifted her head, and her weathered face was wet, and she was smiling in a way that frightened Orla more than any threat could have. "Where did you get the bird, child?" The old woman breathed. "Tell me true, where did it come from?" Orla's hand closed over the sparrow. "It was my mother's," she said. "It is only a bird. It is worth nothing. You can have it, if you—" "It is worth more than this house and every stone in it," Ilona said. Behind her, others had come. Orla saw them now, filling the gallery beyond the door, drawn by the sound, the oldest of the staff. Gray men who had served this family since before Orla was born, a cook with flowers still on her hands. They looked past Ilona into the sealed room, and they saw the thin, frightened woman sitting on the forbidden bed, and they saw the small carved sparrow at her throat catching the morning light. And something moved through them like wind through a field of wheat. One by one, they began to kneel. An old gray man near the front, one of the ones who had carried steel beneath his coat even now, went down the way a felled tree goes down, all at once, and pressed one fist flat to the boards. And Orla heard him say a name under his breath that was not her name, and not anyone's she knew. The murmur she had heard through the door had a shape now. A single word passed mouth to mouth down the gallery, soft and disbelieving and growing. Orla could not make it out. She did not want to. She pressed herself back against the headboard of a dead man's bed, and watched a room full of dangerous men lower themselves to the floor for her. And she had never in all her life been so afraid. Not everyone knelt. At the back of the gallery, half in shadow, a younger man in a good dark suit stood very still. He was not staff. He had the smooth, careful look of a person who counted things for a living, and he was not looking at Orla with wonder. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a number that has just ruined his accounts. For one held breath, their eyes met across the kneeling crowd. Then he turned, unhurried, and walked away toward the main stair. And Orla watched him go, and could not say why the sight of one man leaving frightened her more than all the rest of them kneeling. She did not know his name yet, nor that he had already done the arithmetic of her, weighed what she cost the men he served against what she was worth left breathing, and reached a clean and quiet answer before he ever set foot on the stair. "Fetch him," Ilona said to the room, and her voice had changed, had hardened into something long used to being obeyed. "Fetch the master. Now, before this runs further than we can hold it." A boy ran. Orla sat frozen on the bed, the sparrow biting into her palm, and understood only one thing with any certainty. Whatever she had walked into, whatever the bird meant, whatever these people believed her to be, she would not be allowed to simply vanish back into the walls. That door was shut to her now. It had shut the moment the old woman looked at her throat and wept. She thought of the guardian who had raised her, the hard, frightened woman who had pressed one lesson into her above all others. Do not be owed. Do not be seen. And Orla, sitting in the one bed in the world she should never have touched, began at last to wonder what that woman had been so afraid of, and whether she had been afraid for Orla, or of what Orla might turn out to be. For the first time, Orla let herself wonder whether the woman had loved her at all, or had only kept her carefully safe. The way a person keeps a thing that has always belonged to someone else? Footsteps sounded on the main stair. Heavy, even, unhurried. Coming closer. The master was coming. Severin Cade came into the room, the way winter comes into a house, through a door left open. Orla felt him before she saw him. The kneeling crowd in the gallery drew back from the doorway, without being told, pressing themselves to the walls, and the temperature of the whole floor seemed to fall. Then he was in the doorway, and she understood at last why the staff spoke his name, the way other people speak of storms. A storm did not shout. A storm simply arrived, and rearranged the world, and was gone, and there had never been any arguing with it. He was not large the way the enforcers were large. He was something worse. He was contained. He wore a dark coat over darker clothes, and his face was still in a way that living faces were not meant to be, and his eyes, when they swept the room, moved like a blade being drawn. They took in the kneeling staff. They took in the sealed door, standing open. They took in the founder's bed, unslept in for 20 years, with a stranger sitting in the very middle of it. He had come expecting an intruder. Orla could see the exact shape of what he had come to do, written plainly across him, in the set of his shoulders and the terrible ease of his hands, and she knew with total clarity that she was looking at the last thing a great many people had ever seen. He crossed the threshold no one else had dared to cross. He looked down at her, this small, shaking woman in a servant's uniform who had fouled the one sacred thing his house still kept, and something cold and final settled over his features. "Get her off that bed," he said. His voice was quiet. It was the quietest voice Orla had ever been afraid of. No one moved. He said it again, and it was worse the second time, because the second time it was not loud and it was not soft, it was only certain, the voice of a man who had never once in 20 years been made to give an order twice. Get her off the bed, and still no soul rose. The cook wept into her floured hands. The gray men kept their faces to the boards. That, more than anything, seemed to reach him. Severin Cade turned his head slowly and looked at his own people, kneeling on the floor of a room they were forbidden to enter, not one of them rising to obey a plain order from the man they feared beyond all reason. Orla watched confusion cross his face, and behind it the first thread of something he had clearly not felt in a long time. "Doubt, Ilona," he said. "What is this?" The old woman did not rise. She lifted her chin, and she looked at her master with the tears still bright in her eyes, and she said, "Look at her throat, Severin. Look at what she wears, and then tell me again to put her off his bed." For the first time, he looked at Orla properly, not as a trespasser, as a person. His gaze dropped from her face to the hollow of her throat, to the small, worn sparrow resting there against her pulse, and Orla watched the most dangerous man she had ever seen go, absolutely, perfectly still. She would remember that stillness for the rest of her life. It was not the stillness of a man deciding her fate. It was the stillness of a man whose entire world had been pulled out from under him between one breath and the next. "Where you got that?" he said, and his voice was changed now. Something had broken open in it, something old and buried and raw. It was my mother's, Orla whispered, for the third time that morning. And for the first time, it did not sound like an excuse. It sounded like an answer to a question, far larger than she could see the edges of. Severin Keda reached out one hand, slowly, the way a man reaches toward a thing he does not trust to be real. He did not touch her. He stopped a breath short of the sparrow, and only looked at it, and Orla saw his jaw work, saw him swallow, saw 20 years of something she had no name for, move behind his eyes. Then the man who ruled the city, the man his own people called a storm, the man who had crossed that threshold to end her, lowered himself down onto one knee beside the bed, and bowed his head. The last of the gallery followed. Every soul on that floor was on the ground now, and the only person left standing in all of Orla's world was no one at all. Something in Orla wanted to slide off the far side of the bed and press herself to the floor with the rest of them, only to make the wrongness stop, because a room full of people kneeling to her felt less like honor than like a mistake she would be punished for the instant it was noticed. She had spent her whole life making herself smaller than every room she stood in. Now the largest man in the largest room in the city was down on one knee at her feet, and every instinct she owned was screaming that this could not be allowed to be true. "Forgive me," Severin said, so low that only she could hear it. "We looked for you for 20 years. We believed you were dead. We buried an empty box and swore our lives over it." He lifted his head, and the ruler was gone from his face, and what looked up at her was almost a boy. "We stopped looking. God help me. 3 days ago I sat at a table and agreed to stop looking for good." Orla stared down at him, at all of them, her heart a wild thing beating itself against her ribs. "I do not understand," she said. "I am nobody. I clean floors. I carried your trays through this house. Who do you believe I am?" It was Ilona who answered her, from the floor, in a voice worn thin with weeping and wonder. "You are the sparrow," she said. "You have come home to the nest." They did not question her on a dead man's grave. Ilona would not have it, and Severin Cade, it seemed, could still give the right order when it was set in front of him. They brought her to a small, warm study, with a fire in it, and a chair far too fine for her, and they put a cup of tea into her hands that she did not drink, and the old woman told her who she was, while the master stood at the window, with his back to the room, so still he might have been one more of the dark paintings on the wall. His name had been Tomas Varga, Ilona said. He had built the family out of nothing, out of the harbor mud, into the thing it had become. He had been hard, and he had been terrible, and he had loved exactly one thing in his life without condition, and that had been his daughter. When the long, quiet war came with the house across the river, the house that had wanted everything Tomas built, they came for the child first because they knew she was the one wound that would finish him. So, Thomas did the only thing that could keep her breathing. He gave her away. He sent her out of the city in the dark. Ilona said to people he trusted with his own life, with nothing but a false name and a carved bird, so that one day, when it was safe, we would know her again. And then he sealed his room and swore before all of us that his bed would stay empty until his blood came home to sleep in it. He died, still waiting. We all did. We hunted for you until the hunting had bled our hope dry, and we found graves and false trails and other people's daughters. And at the very last we let ourselves believe the river had taken you. The old woman's hands shook around her cup. And all that while you were carrying trays under this roof, walking past us, emptying our ashes, beneath our own eyes, and not one of us saw. Orla listened to the story of a stranger's love and could not make it lie flat against the shape of her own small life. She thought of the woman who had raised her, the hard, frightened guardian, who had schooled her in the art of being no one, who had burned every photograph, who had moved them in the night more times than Orla could count, who had told her again and again, "Do not be seen, do not be wanted, do not be owed." Orla had believed it was cruelty, or madness, or only the plain fear of a poor woman in a hard world. She saw now that it had been none of those things. It had been a soldier keeping her orders to the last. That woman had not been hiding Orla from landlords. She had been hiding her from the house across the river, and perhaps from this house too. And she had done it so well and so wholly that in the end she had hidden Orla even from herself. "Do not be owed anything," the woman used to say, "because the day you are owed is the day someone comes to collect." Orla looked around the warm room at the faces, watching her with wet and hopeful eyes, and understood that the day had finally come. She was owed everything now. And somewhere in the waking house the man who had turned and walked away was already carrying that debt to whoever it was that paid him. "They will not all be glad of me," Orla said. Her own voice surprised her, steadier than she felt inside. "Will they?" It was Severin who answered, without turning from the glass. "No," he said. "They will not." He gave her the rest in flat, sparse sentences, the way a man reads aloud a sentence of execution. In 2 days, the council was to hold the confirmation, the rite that would declare the founder's line ended forever, and make Severin the head of the house in blood and law alike. Men had spent 20 years, and a great deal of money, making certain that line stayed ended. Chief among them sat at the head of the council table, and his name was Alaric Voss, and it had been his man, Severin said, who walked out of the gallery and down the stairs while the rest of the house was still on its knees. "He will not come at you openly in a corridor," Severin said. "He is far cleverer than that. He will smile, and he will name you a fraud, and he will ask for proof. And while the council argues over it, he will see the proof quietly lost, and then he will see you quietly lost, and he will be very sorry for all of it afterward." At last he turned. In the gray light, his face had gone back to stone. But his eyes, when they found her, were no longer a stranger's. "You walked into the one house in the world that is sworn to die for you," he said, "and the one house in the world with the most reason to bury you. They are the same house. They are mine." Orla set down the tea she had not tasted. "Then let me leave," she said quietly. "I never asked for any of this. I do not want it. I have spent my whole life learning how not to exist. Let me go back to it, and none of you will have to die over a wooden bird." Something moved across Severin Cade's face that she would only much later learn to name as grief. "I would give a great deal to let you," he said. "But I knelt to you within the hour, and so did every soul I command, and a thing like that cannot be taken back. You are the blood of this house now, whether or not you ever wanted blood. There is no door left anywhere that leads back to being no one." He inclined his head, and it was a terrible thing to see. "That small bow from a man like him, I am sworn to you. I cannot so much as take your hand without breaking a vow I made to a dead man over his grave, but I can keep you alive, if you will let me." Orla looked at the man who had come into that room to end her, and now could not bring himself to touch her sleeve, and did not yet know that the not touching would come to matter more than either of them could have guessed. "And if I do not let you," she asked, "then Alaric Voss will have you in the river before the confirmation," Severin said, "and I will spend whatever is left of my life pulling this city apart, stone by stone, to find the men who put you there." Orla did not sleep that night, though they gave her a room with a lock she could turn from the inside, which was the first time in her life a lock had been on her side of a door. She sat on the edge of a bed that was only soft this time, not a grave, and she turned the sparrow over and over in her fingers and tried to decide whether to run. Running was the whole of what she knew. She had run from rooms, from cities, from names, from anyone who looked at her a beat too long. Her guardian had made running into a kind of religion, and Orla had been its most faithful believer. There was a window in this room too, and beneath it, a drain pipe, and past the wall, a city that had never once noticed her, and would not begin now. She could be 3 counties gone by the time the house woke. She could be no one again by nightfall, but she kept thinking of the old gray man, who had gone down like a felled tree, and said a name that was not hers as though it were a prayer. She kept thinking of Alona, weeping on the cold floor. She kept thinking, Most of all, of the things Severin had said, without seeming to know he had said it. We buried an empty box and swore our lives over it. These people had grieved her for 20 years. They had grieved a child they had never met, kept a bed empty for her, kept faith with a ghost. And if she climbed down the drain pipe and vanished, they would go on grieving. And Alaric Foss would stand at the head of his table in 2 days and close the book on the founder's blood, and the old grey man would kneel to no one for the rest of his life. Do not be owed, her guardian had said. But Orla was beginning to understand that she had been owed since the night she was carried out of this city in the dark, and that no amount of running had ever made that debt smaller. It had only made her lonely. There was a soft knock at the door near dawn. Not Ilona. When Orla opened it, Severin Cade stood in the corridor, and behind him a lean, watchful younger man she had not seen before, with quiet hands and a scar through one eyebrow. "This is Roan," Severin said. "He has been mine since we were both boys with nothing. There is no one in this house I trust further. If I am not in a room, he is the room." Rowan inclined his head to Orla, and it was not quite a bow, but it was close, and she saw him clock the sparrow at her throat and then, deliberately, look away from it, as though he understood that she did not want to be a bird. "I thought you might be gone," Severin said to her. "There is a drain pipe. I had Rowan leave it exactly where it was." "You wanted to see if I would use it," Orla said. "I wanted you to have it," Severin said. "A person who is not free to leave is a prisoner, whatever we choose to call her. I will not add my chains to the ones you were born into." He paused. "But I am glad you are still here. Not for the house." It was the wrong thing to say, and the only true thing, and it landed somewhere under Orla's ribs and stayed there. She made her choice then, standing in a doorway in a dead man's house, with a lock on her side for the first time in her life. "I am not going to run," she said. Her voice shook and she let it. "If I run, they win by doing nothing at all, and the old man downstairs kneels to no one, and you spend the rest of your life pretending you agreed to bury me. I am tired of being the thing everyone hides." She lifted her chin, and it cost her more than she would ever tell him. "So I am going to be seen. I do not know how, but I am done disappearing." It was the bravest sentence she had ever spoken, and it frightened her more than the drainpipe, more than the men gathering out in the city, more than anything Alaric Foss could send against her. To be seen on purpose. She had always been certain it would be the end of her. Now, she was going to find out. Something changed in Severin's face. It was not softness, exactly. It was more like a man watching a fire he had thought long dead breathe out one live coal. Then, "Hear what I am about to do," he said, "so that you can stop me if you wish, because after this hour there will be no stopping it." He drew a breath. "Within the hour I am sending word to every member of the council that the confirmation is suspended, not delayed. Suspended on my authority as steward, on the ground that the founder's blood has returned to his house and slept in his bed, and that no man alive will crown me over a living Varga." Orla stared at him. "And what happens when you send that?" "War," Severin said simply. "Alaric will not accept it. He cannot. A living heir is the one thing his whole life cannot survive. The moment that message leaves this house, he stops being a man at a table and becomes a man hunting you. And the house across the river, the one that came for you when you were small, they have watched for 20 years too. If they learn the sparrow is alive, they will want to finish what they began before you can grow into a threat." He looked at her steadily. "I can send it, or I can burn it, and we find a quieter way, and you stay a secret a while longer. Tell me which." Orla thought of a lifetime of quiet. She thought of what the quiet had cost. "Send it," she said. Severin held her gaze a moment. Then he turned to Roan, and Roan was already moving, and the message went out into the grey morning like a stone dropped into still water, and every ring it made was another hand somewhere closing into a fist. The war had a beginning now. Orla had given it one, and for the first time she could remember, She had made her room turn toward her on purpose, and had not once wished to be small. The house changed around her over the next day, the way a body tightens before a blow. Rowan doubled the men on the walls and halved the ones allowed near Orla, so that only faces Severin had known for years came within reach of her. The great gates stayed shut. Cars came and went on other errands, and Orla understood without being told that some of them carried her name out into the city and brought back word of who was gathering against it. Ilona would not leave her side. The old woman fed her, which Orla could not remember anyone doing since she was a child, and while she ate, Ilona told her the small human things that Severin, in his grief and his strategy, had not thought to say. That Thomas Varga had a laugh you could hear across a courtyard, that he had kept the sparrow's twin, a second carving, on his desk until the day he died, turning it in his fingers when he thought no one was looking. That he had never once, in all the long years of searching, allowed anyone to say the word dead in his hearing, he knew. Ilona said in here, she pressed a hand to her own chest. Fathers know when they are all a child has. He knew you were out there somewhere. He only ran out of years before he ran out of hope. It was in the middle of this, of all things, that Orla finally asked the question she had been carrying since the gallery. The woman who raised me, she said. She told me she was ill, she told me it was her heart. She died in a chair by the window, and I was in the next room, and I did not even hear it happen. Orla's hands had gone very still around the cup. Was it her heart? Ilona's face did the kindest and most terrible thing. It tried to lie, and could not. It was Severin who answered, from the doorway where he had a habit of appearing without sound. No, he said quietly. It was not her heart. He came in and sat across from her, and he did not soften it, because he had already learned that Orla did not want things softened. We know now what we did not know then, he said. 3 years ago, a man was sent to a town. None of us had any reason to know, to a quiet street, to a woman living under a name that meant nothing to anyone. He was very good at making hearts stop. We found the record of the payment only this morning. Once we knew at last what we were looking for. Your guardian did not die of anything but keeping her promise. They found her. They asked her where the child was. And she died in that chair by the window, without giving you up, with you asleep in the next room. And then the man who had come for her walked past your door and left you breathing, because to him you were nobody. You were exactly the nobody she had spent her life making you into. Severin's jaw was tight. She saved your life twice that night, once by her silence, once by how well she had hidden you. Orla did not cry. She had never been a person who could afford to cry. She sat with it, this new and enormous fact, that the hard, frightened woman who had never once said she loved her had loved her enough to die in a chair rather than point at a door. She loved me, Orla said. It was not a question. It was a thing she was setting down at last, after carrying it her whole life. She loved you more than her own breath, Ilona said. And she never let you see it, because a girl who knew she was loved might have grown careless, might have forgotten to be invisible, and you were only alive because you were invisible. The wound refrain turned over inside Orla and became something else entirely. Do not be owed, the woman had said. Because the day you are owed is the day someone comes to collect. She had not been teaching Orla to be small out of cruelty. She had been teaching her to survive the exact day that had now arrived. Later, when Ilona had gone, Severin took her to the sealed room again, in daylight this time, and showed her the things a father leaves behind. A portrait of a young man with a hard mouth and Orla's own uncertain eyes. The second sparrow on the desk, its wings worn smooth by a dead man's thumb. A letter, sealed and never sent, addressed in a heavy hand to a daughter whose face he would never see. He held it out to her, and did not let his fingers touch hers as he passed it, and she noticed and understood and hated the little distance he kept, even as she knew why he kept it. You can read it alone, he said, or not at all. It is yours. Now, everything here is yours. I do not want everything, Orla said. She looked up at him. I want to know why you will not touch my hand. Because the last thing I swore to your father, Severin said, was that if his blood ever came home, I would guard it with my life and never once presume upon it. He looked at her as though the words cost him teeth. A man like me does not get to want a thing like you. I get to keep you alive, and hand you a house, and step back. That is the whole of what I am allowed. And if I do not want you to step back, Orla said. Severin Kada, who feared nothing in the waking world, looked genuinely afraid, and did not answer, because before he could a heavy tread came fast up the corridor, and Rowan was in the doorway, with the grim look of a man carrying the worst kind of news. The council has answered, Rowan said. They will sit tomorrow, and they have agreed to hear her claim, all of them, even Voss, and Voss agreed first and fastest of anyone. He looked between them. Which means he already knows how he means to win. They will demand proof of her blood in front of the whole table. Hard proof. And we do not have any. The founder is dead. The guardian is dead, and a carved bird will not survive 1 hour of Alaric Voss asking politely who exactly gave it to her. The little warm room went cold. Orla looked down at her father's unopened letter and understood that being owed everything was worth nothing at all if she could not prove the debt. They had until the council sat, and the council would not kneel to a sparrow on a cord. Ilona said it plainly. The old ones would weep for Orla, but the council was not the old ones. It was cold men who had backed Alaric Voss because Alaric Voss won, and they would want proof they could hold in their hands, proof that could not be waved away as an old woman's hope and a piece of carved wood. We have nothing, Rowan said. The guardian burned everything. The founder is 20 years dead. The bird proves only that she owns a bird. Orla was not listening to them. She had gone very still in her chair, the way she used to go still, when a landlord's footsteps came down a hall and she was staring at nothing, and then she was not staring at nothing. She was staring at the door and past it, at a room upstairs, at a battered coat hanging on a hook. My coat, she said. They looked at her. When she died, Orla said slowly, when my guardian died, the one thing she made me swear was that I would never throw out that coat. I thought she was only being poor. I thought it was just what you did. When you had nothing, you kept the nothing. She stood up. She was shaking. She used to mend it when she thought I was asleep. Always the lining. I could never once see what was wrong with the lining. They brought her the coat. The coat that had stopped being warm 2 winters ago. The coat she had carried through every city and every false name. The one thing from her old life she had refused, without ever understanding why, to let go of. Her hands were steady now, the way they were only ever steady when everything else was chaos. She turned it inside out. She found the seam that had been opened and closed, more times than any seam in a poor woman's coat had reason to be. She worked her thumbnail into the thread. The lining gave, and folded flat against the wool, dry and yellow and covered edge to edge in a dead woman's cramped and careful hand, were pages. Orla read them aloud, because her voice would not stay in her throat if she read them in silence. The first line of them undid her. If you are reading this, the woman had written, then I am gone, and I am sorry, and you must be very brave now, because the thing I spent your whole life hiding you from has come at last, and this is the one you cannot run from. You were never nobody. I only needed you to believe it, so that they would believe it too. Forgive me the years of it. Everything I did because I loved you, and because your father asked me to keep you breathing, and I did. They were a testament. Her guardian had written down everything, a little at a time, across years, against the day she might not live to speak it. She had written the true name of the child she carried, and the true name of the man who had fathered her. She had written the night they came out of the city, and who had arranged it, and who had betrayed it. Because the men who came for the child that first night, the men who forced Tomas Varga to give his daughter away, had not found the nursery by luck. Someone inside the house had drawn them a map. Someone who stood at Thomas's right hand and smiled at his table, and swore loyalty to his blood, had sold the location of a sleeping child to the house across the river in exchange for the one thing that man had always wanted and could never earn. The chair at the head of the table. When Tomas was gone, her guardian had a name for that man. She had written it 3 times, pressing so hard the pen had torn the paper as though she feared the ink alone would not be believed. Alaric Voss. The room had gone entirely silent. Orla looked up. Severin Kate had not moved. But every scrap of the man she had come to know had been stripped away, and what stood in his place was something very old and very cold. "Say the rest," he said. There was more. Her guardian had known she was being hunted, not by the river house alone, but by Voss, because a living heir was the one witness who could some day drag his treason into the light. He had spent 20 years making certain the search always looked hard and always failed, feeding false trails to the very men who searched, burying hope by inches. And when at last, 3 years ago, his people found the quiet street and the quiet woman, it had been Voss who signed the payment that stopped her heart in a chair by a window, not the river house. Voss. Tidying the last loose thread of the crime that had built his whole life. He had not known the thread had a daughter asleep in the next room. Orla set the pages down. She found that she was not shaking anymore. It was him, she said. Not them. Him, the man who is going to sit at the head of that table tomorrow and ask me, so very politely, to prove that I am real. She had been taught since she was small to fear the day someone came to collect. She had never once imagined the collector might have a name, and a chair, and a smile. She had probably poured wine for 100 times without ever being seen. Severin's silence was the loudest thing in the house. Orla looked at him and understood something he had not said. She could see it working through him. The particular horror of a man learning that the person he had trusted most in all the world had been the rot at the very root of everything he was sworn to protect. Whatever Alaric Voss was, to this house, he was something older and closer to Severin, and the discovery was costing him in a place Orla could not reach and did not yet have the right to. It was Ilona who broke it, and what she said turned the whole night on its edge. The green door, the old woman said faintly. In the gallery, the one that was unlocked. Everyone looked at her. I did not unlock it, Ilona said. I sent you to the servant's room at the far end, child, 3 doors further on, not his. I would never have sent you to his. She pressed her hand to her mouth. But old Tobin, who went down first this morning, who wept and said the name, Tobin has kept a key to that room for 40 years, because Thomas trusted him to dust it and no one else. And Tobin saw you carry a tray past him 3 nights ago. Tobin saw the bird. She looked at Orla with wonder and with something close to fear. He knew, Ilona whispered. Before any of us. He is old, and he is frightened, and he did not dare to say it aloud, because to be wrong would have cost him his life, and to be right would have started exactly this. So he did the only thing an old faithful man could do. He left a door open, and he let the house find you where no liar could ever explain you away. In the founder's own bed, he gave us proof no counsel could argue with, and he let you carry the blame if it went wrong. So it had not been fate, and it had not been luck. An old man who had kept faith for 40 years had quietly bet his life that the sparrow had come home and had opened a door in the dark. Orla thought she might finally cry after all. She did not. She looked at the testament and at her father's letter she had not yet dared to open, and at the 2 carved sparrows, hers and the dead man's, resting side by side on the table. Then, this is what we take to the council, she said. Not a bird, a confession, in her own hand. He took her life, and he sold me, and he has been lying at that table for 20 years, and I am going to stand up in front of every cold man he owns and make them look at it. He will not let you reach the table, Severin said. The moment he learns this exists, and he will learn, he has ears in these walls we have not yet found. He will do tonight what he has spent 2 decades doing quietly. He will come for the proof, and he will come for you. And this time, he will not send a courier, he will send everything. Then let him come tonight, Orla said, and heard her guardian in her own voice, and did not flinch from it. Let him come to the one house in the world that is sworn to die for me. She looked at Severin, at Roan, at Ilona, at the pages in her hand. I spent my whole life running from the collection. I am done running. Bring me the day I am owed. Severin looked at her for a long moment, and then he did a thing Orla had not seen him do. Not once. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a storm that has finally been given a direction. Roan, he said, without looking away from her, wake the house. All of it. Tonight, the sparrow holds the nest. They came in the deepest part of the night, the way such men always do, when the body is least willing to believe it must fight. Orla stood at the tall window of the founder's study, with the testament sealed in oilcloth against her chest. Severin had said the safest place for the proof was on the one person no loyal soul in the house would let fall, and she had refused the cellar they wanted to fold her into. I am done being put in cellars, she had told him. If they take this house, the pages do not matter, because I will be in the river by dawn regardless, so I will stand where I can see. He had not liked it, he had not argued. She saw the first of them come over the outer wall like water finding a crack. There was no shouting. Men in dark clothes dropped into the grounds and moved toward the house with the awful patience of people who had done this before. They were the river house. She knew it in her spine before Rowan's voice came low through the door. They had waited 20 years for the sparrow to show her face, and Voss had handed them the night and the reason. Then the quiet broke, all at once, into the flat, muffled sounds of fighting in the dark, and the sound of Severin Cade's house, doing what it had been built to do. Rowan met them at the doors with a dozen men who had served the founder's blood their whole lives and had spent 2 decades with nothing worth guarding. Now they had something. Severin had gone down into it without a word, and she caught sight of him once crossing the lit gallery below. With the same terrible economy he brought to everything, it went wrong the way such nights go wrong. There were more of them than there should have been, which meant the ears in the walls Severin had feared were real and close. A knot of the attackers broke through a servant's passage that should have been sealed and came up the back stair, toward the founder's wing, toward the study, toward her, and the young footman, left to guard that stair, was too green and too frightened, and for one long moment the whole night tipped toward ruin. The young footman was not the only soul on that landing. The old ones were there. Tobin, who had left a door open and started all of this, stood at the top of the stair, his old hands shaking and empty of anything that could stop them, and terror plain in his face. And he was not going to be enough, and he knew it, and he stood there anyway. Orla did not decide to move. She was simply, suddenly, in the doorway of the study, where every frightened servant on that floor could see her. She carried nothing that could hurt anyone. She carried the one thing that mattered more in that house than anything that could. She had the sparrow at her throat and the founder's blood in her face, and when the wavering half-armed old men and the terrified young ones saw her standing there in the light, unhidden, unafraid, not folded into any cellar but on her feet in the founder's own doorway, something in them straightened. Tobin's hands went still. The green footman lifted his chin. A house that had spent 20 years kneeling to an empty bed, found in the worst moment of the night. A living thing to stand for. Hold the stair, Orla said. Her voice did not shake. She did not know where the steadiness came from, and then she did. It came from a woman who had died in a chair rather than point at a door. For the founder, she said, and they held it. By the time Severin reached the landing, the tide had already turned, because a defended stair is grim, costly work, and the rivermen had not come expecting the house to have a heart to fight for. What was left of them broke and ran for the walls. Rowan's people took the ones who did not run fast enough, And in the sudden ringing quiet that followed, with the smell of powder hanging in the grand cold air, they found Alaric Voss. He had not come over the wall with his hired men. He was far too careful for that. He had come through a door held open for him by his own creature inside the house, a senior guard named Petrick, who had taken his money for years and counted tonight on the house falling. It had not fallen. Roan's people had taken him at his own post, the open door still in his hand, and he had not even tried to run. And so Alaric Voss, who had meant to arrive at the very end and be sorrowful over the fallen, was caught in the Founder's Gallery, with no rivermen left to hide behind, and no counsel left to lie to. Severin Cade crossed the gallery toward the man who had made him, because that was the thing Orla had not understood until she saw their two faces close together at last. It had been Alaric Voss who lifted a hard, orphaned boy out of nothing 20 years ago and shaped him into the thing he needed, and set him in the steward's chair. Severin owed the man everything he was. And the man had made him, Orla realized, precisely so that when the Founder's blood was finally declared dead, the house would pass not to a Varga, but to a puppet Voss had carved with his own hands. "You raised me to be your chair," Severin said. It was not a question. Alaric Voss did not grovel. That was almost the worst of it. He straightened his coat, and he looked at Severin with the weary patience of a man explaining simple arithmetic to a child, and he made his case, because men like him always believe the case can still be made. "I built this house as peace," he said. "Tomas would have burned the whole world down for one child. I was the only one with the stomach to think past his heart. A living heir is a war. She is a war. I did what had to be done so that men like you and me could steward something that was not on fire. If that required a hard thing in a nursery 20 years ago, then it required a hard thing, and I have never once lost sleep over it." "You sold a sleeping child to your enemies for a chair," Orla said. She stepped out into the light where he could see her fully, and Alaric Voss looked at her properly for the first time. At the sparrow, at the face that was Thomas Varga's face, worn by a woman who cleaned floors for a living, and for one instant, not conviction. Not some cold, hard wisdom, fear, small, old, cornered fear. He had not sold her for peace. He had sold her because he wanted the chair and was not willing to wait for it or to earn it, and every lofty word since had been the long-practiced lie of a coward dressing a theft in the language of duty. "You are not a hard man who did a necessary thing," Orla said, and her quiet voice carried the whole length of the ruined gallery. "You are a frightened man who did a greedy one, and then spent your entire life too proud to say so. You did not take that woman's life for peace. You took it because she was the last person alive who could call you a thief. She held up the oilcloth packet. She wrote it all down before you ever found her. She beat you from a chair by a window 3 years dead." Voss's face went gray. "Be done with it then," he said to Severin, because he still believed this was Severin's to decide. "Get it over with. Do not let her make a speech of it." And here was the moment the whole night had been walking toward, and Severin Cade did not reach for anything. He looked instead at Orla. He looked at the woman he was sworn to, and he waited, because it was hers, all of it, and he had understood that before she had. Orla thought about it. She thought about how easy it would be, and how much of her wanted it, and how her guardian had died so that Orla could grow up into a person who held exactly that kind of power. And she thought about the plain fact that if the first thing she did with a house full of witnesses was order a death in that gallery, then Alaric Voss would have won the only argument that ever mattered to him, the one where a Varga was a war and nothing else. "No," she said. Voss blinked. "You do not get the clean night in the river you gave her," Orla said. "You do not get to be a quiet loose end for Severin to explain away. You are going to stand in front of your own council, alive, in the daylight, and I am going to read them your confession in the hand of the woman you silenced. And I am going to watch every cold man you bought understand exactly what they back." She stepped closer, and she was not afraid of him, and that, she saw, unsettled him more than any threat could have. And then you are going to spend what is left of your life as the one thing you were always most afraid of being. Take him, she said to Roan. Alive, every hair on his head. Roan took him. Alaric Voss went out of the Founders' Gallery, with his hands bound and his mouth finally, completely shut, and the house that had knelt to a sparrow watched the man who had ruled it for 20 years led away by the blood he had tried so hard to bury. Severin came to stand beside her in the wreckage. He did not touch her, but he looked at her the way a man looks at the sunrise after the longest night of his life. You would have been within your rights, he said quietly. I know, Orla said. I did not want to be right. I wanted to be seen doing something better than he ever did. She was shaking now that it was over, the way she never let herself shake, until it was safe. I have been nobody my whole life, Severin. I am not going to become him in order to stop being it. The council met the next day, in daylight, exactly as Orla had promised it would. The room where they sat was older than the family itself, a long dark chamber of stone and smoke, where the men who owned the city came to divide it up between them. Orla had spent a good portion of her life scrubbing floors like these. She walked across this one, and did not scrub it, and felt the strangeness of that in every single step. They had expected a girl they could frighten. That much was plain in their faces when she came in, the 12 cold men of the council, braced to pick apart a servant's daughter's claim across a long, slow morning until it came to nothing. What they got instead was a woman who set a packet of yellowed pages on the table and read, in a flat, clear voice, the confession of a woman 3 years dead, in a hand that several of them recognized, naming the man at the head of their own table as the traitor who had sold the founder's child, and the man who had silenced the last witness to it. She did not raise her voice once. She had learned long ago that the quietest person in a dangerous room is often the one most worth fearing. And she had learned it. She understood now, from watching men exactly like these. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Alaric Voss sat bound at the foot of the table where they had placed him, and he did not defend himself, because there was no defense the pages did not already answer, and the cold men of the council looked at him and did the arithmetic that cold men do, and Orla watched them understand, one after another, that the ground had shifted, and that the man they had backed was finished, and that the only question left in the room was which side of the new line each of them wished to be standing on when the smoke cleared. It is her hand, the oldest of them said at last. Of the dead woman's writing, I knew it 30 years ago. It is her hand. And it was over, the way these things are truly over. Not with a blow but with a slow turning of the whole room, like a tide that has quietly decided. They would have confirmed her on the spot. That was the strange part, the part Orla had not been ready for. The very council that had come to bury her line was within the hour, prepared to put the entire weight of the house behind her, to kneel to the sparrow, to hand her everything Tomas had built, and everything Voss had stolen, because that was what such men did the moment a tide turned. They ran to stand in front of it. Orla looked at them, the 12 cold faces, waiting to see what she would demand of them. I do not want you to kneel, she said. They stared at her. I have watched people kneel for 2 days now, she said, and I have hated every moment of it, because a person kneeling is not a person seeing you. It is a person deciding you are safely above them, where you can no longer look them in the eye. My father hid me in a life where no one ever knelt, and it very nearly broke me. But it taught me one thing not one of you ever learned in this room. It taught me exactly what the people you step over are worth. She let that sit in the smoke. I will take my father's chair. I have earned it in blood. I never asked to spill, but you will not kneel to me. You will stand, and you will look at me, and you will remember every day that the head of this house spent her whole life, invisible to men, just like you, and that she is watching now, and that she has not forgotten how it feels to be stepped over. It was not what they had expected. It was, she could see plainly, a great deal more frightening than any demand for their necks. Severin found her afterward on the cold gallery above the chamber, where she had gone to breathe. He kept his careful distance, the arm's length he had held for 2 days, the little gap his vow had carved out between them, and she was so tired of that gap now that she could have wept. "You did not take his life," Severin said. "And you did not take their knees." He shook his head slowly. "In one morning, you have made yourself harder to fight than any ruler this house has ever had, because a man can plot against a tyrant. No one alive knows what to do with a Varga who tells the council to look her in the eye." Orla turned to face him. "There is one more thing I mean to do today that no one will know what to do with," she said. She crossed the little gap herself. He went still, the way he had gone, still in the founder's room when he first saw the sparrow, the stillness of a man whose whole world is quietly being moved beneath him. "You keep telling me what you are allowed," Orla said. "You swore to my father that if his blood came home you would guard it and never presume upon it, and you have kept that vow so hard it has become the wall between us. So, I am going to make it very simple for you." She reached out, and she did the thing he had not let himself do. She took his hand, deliberately, in both of hers, and held it. "There. The vow is not yours to keep any longer. It is mine to release, because I am the blood you swore it to, and I am standing here releasing you from it. You did not presume. I reached. Now you cannot hide behind a dead man's grave, because the dead man's daughter has told you to stop." Severin Cade looked down at their joined hands as though he did not entirely trust them to be real. "I came into that room to end you," he said, very low. "I know," Orla said. "I have knelt to you. The whole house has knelt to you. You could have anything now, anyone." He looked at her, and for once the storm was entirely gone, and what was left was only a man who had guarded a grave for 20 years and was frightened to want the living thing standing in front of him. "Why would you reach for the one who was sent to end you?" "Because you are the only one who never once looked at the bird," Orla said. "From the very first morning, every other soul in this house sees the sparrow when they look at me. You are the only one who kept looking past it at me, and being sorry it was not enough to let you any closer." She tightened her hands around his. "I spent my whole life waiting to be seen, and terrified of it in the same breath. You are the only person I have ever wanted to be seen by. So, look at me, not the blood. Me." And Severin Cade, who feared nothing in all the waking world, finally, carefully, as though she might break, or he might, lifted his other hand and touched her face, and did not break a single vow in the doing of it. The house across the river had been at war with the house of Varga for so long that most of the men who started it were bones now, and the war had simply gone on, the way wars do, out of habit and pride, and the plain fact that no one had ever once given anyone a reason to stop. Orla gave them one. She did not send an army across the water, though she could have, and though every old gray man in her house would have followed her gladly to do it. She sent a letter, instead, in her own hand, and then she went herself, with Severin at her shoulder, and Rowan at her back, and the sparrow at her collar, where anyone could see it now, because she was finished hiding it. She sat across a table from the head of the house that had twice tried to end her, an old hard woman named Vesna, with a face like a closed fist, and she laid Voss's confession on the wood between them, and she told the truth that neither house had ever once been allowed to see. "He used you," Orla said. "The very same man. 20 years ago, Alaric Voss sold you the location of a child, and told you it was your chance to finally break the Vargas, and you took it. And it started this war, and the war has cost your house as many sons as it ever cost mine. But you were never breaking us for yourselves. You were bleeding for him, so that while 2 houses tore at each other across a river, one careful man could climb quietly to the top of a table. You have been his instrument for a generation, and you called it your pride." The old woman across the table looked at the confession for a very long time. "I am the child you were sent to end, and I am sitting at your table offering you the one thing Voss spent his whole life making certain neither of us could ever have. An ending." I have no sons to feed to your war and no wish to feed yours to mine. Bury the man who did this to both of us, not each other. When she finally spoke, her voice was like gravel shifting. My eldest son died in a boat on that river, she said. 11 winters ago over a war I was told was mine. She touched the pages with one blunt finger as though testing whether they would burn her. I have hated the name Varga since before you were born, girl. I taught my grandchildren to hate it, and now you sit here telling me I taught them to grieve over a man who was never even our enemy. She looked up, and the closed fist of her face had come open just enough to show the exhaustion under it. Orla had seen that exhaustion in a mirror. It was the look of a person who has carried a heavy thing so long they have forgotten they were ever allowed to set it down. What it is you want, Vesna said at last. Not what you are offering. What you want. I want to be the last one, Orla said. The last child anyone has to carry out of a city in the dark. The last woman who dies in a chair keeping a secret. End it with me. And no one who comes after us has to inherit any of it. It did not end all at once. Such things never do. But it ended. Over that table and the tables that came after it. Because Orla Sorrel had learned in a hard school how to see the person the whole world had decided not to look at. And she saw, in the old woman across the water, someone who was every bit as tired of the collecting as she was. The peace they built was not a soft one. It cost both houses, ships, and streets, and old prides. And there were men, on each side of the water, who called it weakness, and had to be shown, quietly. It held because, for the first time in 2 decades, the two houses were not being turned against each other by a man in the shadows counting his winnings. And once people can finally see the strings, Orla was learning, they stopped dancing on them. She came home across the river at dusk, and the house was waiting for her, and it did not kneel, because she had forbidden it to. But every soul in it was standing in the courtyard to see her come, and that, she found, was a thing she could bear. Standing, they could look at her. Standing, she could look back at them. Ilona was crying again. Of course. Tobin, who had left a door unlocked and gambled his whole old life on a bird, stood at the front with his hat crushed in his hands, and Orla went to him, first, before Severin, before any of them. She took the second carved sparrow, her father's own, and the one worn smooth by a dead man's thumb across 20 years of waiting, and she pressed it into Tobin's shaking hands. You kept the faith longer than any of us, she told him. You should be the one to hold it. That night she stood at the window of the room that had been her father's and was now impossibly hers. And she did not sleep in a grave, because it was not a grave any longer. It was only a room where a frightened man had loved a daughter he would never meet, and where that daughter had finally come home to sleep. Alone, first. Before Severin came to her, she opened the letter at last. She had carried it unread for days, afraid of it the way she had been afraid of the bed, afraid that a dead father's words would ask something of her she could not give, she need not have been. It was short, a hard man's hand, gone unsteady near the end. I do not know your face, he had written, and I never will, and that is the one debt of my life I cannot pay. I gave you away so that you might live. If you are reading this, then either I failed and you found your way home regardless, which would be very like my blood, or else someone kept a promise for me that cost them everything they had. Be gentler than I was. Be harder than they will expect. And do not let this house ever make you into a thing that steps over people. You will always know the ones worth saving. They will be the ones no one else is looking at. He had not signed it father. He had signed it only Thomas, one stranger to another. Orla read it 3 times, and then she folded it away, and for the first time in her whole life, she let herself weep, quietly, for a man she had never met, who had somehow known exactly the woman she would grow up to be. Severin came and stood beside her, close now, aloud now, his hand finding hers, without a single vow left in the world to stop it. They will tell it strangely, he said. The girl who carried out the ashes and woke up the head of the house. No one will believe the true part. Which part is that? Orla asked. That the whole of it turned, he said, on the fact that for years not one of us ever bothered to look at you twice. He lifted her hand, and he touched the small worn sparrow at her throat, the one thing she had carried through every hidden year of her life, without ever once knowing what it truly was. You were under our roof the entire time. We stepped over you 1,000 times. And the single day we finally looked down, the whole house fell to its knees. Orla closed her hand over his, over the sparrow, over 20 years of being no one at all. Then let them tell it strangely, she said. She looked out over the city that had never once seen her, and would never now be able to stop. I think I have earned a strange story. The sparrow had come home to the nest. And the girl who had once been paid to disappear would never disappear again. Orla Sorrel did not simply survive the house that was sworn to bury her. She walked into it as no one at all, slept one accidental night in a dead man's forbidden bed, and walked out the only name a room full of dangerous men would ever kneel to. And then, because she remembered exactly what it was to be stepped over, she taught them all to stand instead. If you love a story where the overlooked one turns out to have held every card the whole time, where the quiet girl in the corner was the answer nobody thought to look for, then do the one thing that helps this channel most. Tap that like button, subscribe so the next story finds its way to you, and tell me down in the comments what your favorite moment was. Was it the first kneel, the coat, the held stare, or the moment she told the whole cold council to look her in the eye? I will see you in the next one.